The patterns and rhythms found in ancient cities and in the lives of their inhabitants may hold important lessons for us as we become a more and more urban world. I hope you've sensed by now that I think that many of the things that define our cities are based on decisions taken in antiquity. And to study the range of urban life in that period is to learn about our own world and our choices in how to live. With the emphasis on sustainability, green building, and the new urbanism, as well as the re-emphasis on urban rather than suburban spaces, many aspects of the ancient urban world seem ripe for integration into our urban lives. Now, you would be forgiven for doubting that most of the elements of ancient cities that we've discussed in this course are at all relevant to modern cities. After all, I've made the point repeatedly that different cultures and different political forms have different needs. Why wouldn't some of the bases for cities in the ancient world have been abandoned? And in fact, not every element of ancient cities has endured in modern architecture and urban design. But a significant number have. Let's consider two more recent cities that incorporate the ancient past, Venice and London. If you look at a really good map of Venice, and I have to say I love old maps and their remarkable details and precise designs, you'll see a city that initially makes you think that none of the lessons of antiquity made it past the Middle Ages. Venice displays a lack of rational planning that would be home at Çatalhöyük. Its founding was, as the Roman historian Livy said of Rome itself, more of an occupation than a planned settlement. The islands that came to make Venice were gradually settled, starting in the 6th century AD, by refugees from the German invasions of northern Italy. So it grew gradually and without plan as just more and more people moved here until eventually these islands were all connected and, in fact, much of the lagoon filled in. And a plan was never imposed on it. And this is an extraordinarily rich city, one of the great powers of the medieval Mediterranean, controlling an empire and a vast trading fleet and contacts. But a city still in need of more than that for legitimacy. And for that, the legitimacy, it looked back to some of the great cities of antiquity. There's no doubt that the center of Venice is St. Mark's Cathedral, San Marco to the locals, and the Doge's Palace next door. San Marco is here in Venice and has developed the importance it has because in AD 828, Venetian merchants, I suppose the polite word would be acquired, but stolen is also accurate, they stole the relics, that is, the body of the evangelist St. Mark, from where it had been buried in Alexandria, and brought it to Venice, where it became the centerpiece of the religious identity of the city. Now note that the relics came from Alexandria, then the premier city and harbor in the Mediterranean, a status to which Venice and her merchant class aspired. Religious identity and ancient culture are still powerful things to be transmitted to a city, giving it legitimacy and status. Images not just of St. Mark, but of the acquisition of the body of St. Mark as a major event are all over the cathedral, and not just all over the cathedral, they're in mosaic. They're there permanently in stone, and they're found throughout the city. It was to be celebrated for centuries. Now, as an interesting side note, the people of Alexandria have never been happy with Venice for removing the remains of St. Mark. Their repeated attempts to get these returned only reinforce the point of these relics' cultural impact. Finally, as a matter of fact, in 1968, Venice returned a small fragment of bone to Alexandria. Well, in addition to the relics of St. Mark, if you walk around the church, the cathedral in Venice, that is literally around it outside, you'll find many rather, odd works of art that don't seem to fit in, literally. Some are stuck on. They stick out to you visually because of their materials or style, and actually quite literally protruding out of the walls of the church, both inside and out. These include a remarkable statue in porphyry. Now, porphyry is an important stone because there's only one place it comes from in the world. In Latin, Mons Porphyrides, the Porphyry Mountain. It's in the middle of Egypt, and this really incredibly deep purple-colored stone was, in the Roman world, restricted to the use of Roman emperors. And so what we have here at Venice, just stuck onto the outside of the cathedral, is a porphyry statue of 4 Roman emperors, all in a group. There are also 4 gilded bronze horses that for centuries stood above the front door of the cathedral. Both of these, the 4 emperors and the 4 horses, were part of the loot that Venice brought back from the sack of Constantinople in AD 1204. Another acquisition of the cultural heritage of an older prominent city. These were considered great trophies at the time, and also very clearly considered as signs of the shift of power in the Mediterranean from Constantinople to Venice. The horses, by the way, were originally part of a sculpture in the Hippodrome of Constantinople that featured 4 horses pulling a chariot. That is a quadriga, the 4-horse chariot. We don't know if they were in fact pulling a chariot that held an image of a famous charioteer or of an emperor, because the form is identical. They have identical iconography. Well, I say originally from Constantinople. I should have said most recently from Constantinople, because some scholars think that the horses were brought to the city of Constantinople from Rome by Constantine when he founded the city and really made it the new capital of the Roman Empire. In another attempt to add a layer of cultural significance to the story, it's told that they, the horses, were original works by the Greek master sculptor of the 4th century BC, Lysippus. But I think that's unlikely. It's more likely that they were repurposed from a monument in Rome. I think the leading contender is one of the triumphal arches of the Emperor Trajan. Constantine actually very deliberately and selectively picked monuments from past emperors, and actually seems to have only picked monuments from Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, 3 of the 5 good emperors, and put those on his own monuments to create those connections between himself and these great predecessors. Well, the tour of great cities that these horses took and their role as transmitters of cultural authority doesn't end in Venice, actually. In 1797, having promised the Republic of Venice to his allies, the Austrians, Napoleon invaded the city, and he took it, ending its 1,100 years of independence. At that point, the horses were shipped to Paris, what was then the cultural capital of Europe, along with much of the countries that Napoleon had occupied. Iconic works from Italy were also shipped to Paris and put on display as, well, cultural capital. The horses were only returned to Venice after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. Now, when we consider the city of London, we can recognize many of the same trends and tendencies that we did at Venice. It has a different history, of course, from its origins as the Roman city of Londinium and its eventual role as the capital of Britain and, in fact, the entire British Empire. Although Londinium was abandoned by the Romans in the 5th century AD and was apparently unoccupied for some time thereafter, modern London's layout of curving streets that follow topography rather than an orthogonal plan really is based on the Anglo-Saxon city established here in AD 500. The city grew without any plan or urban design. In fact, the Greater London area is really a patchwork of many smaller communities that have been joined together into this metropolis. And in fact, fairly recently, if you read A Christmas Carol, you'll learn that Chelsea at the time was considered a separate city and in fact far away from London itself. The temptation to view this new metropolis as the inheritor of Alexandria, or even better, Olympus, with its synoikism, the gathering of different small communities into one city, is very strong. And to quote Oscar Wilde, since we're in Britain, I can resist everything except temptation. So, synoikism it is. And actually, that's not a bad model when you consider that London is the inheritor of Alexandria as first, the largest city in the world at one time, in London's case, for most of the 19th century. And second, that London in the 19th century finally delivered an infrastructure, particularly a system for the delivery of fresh water, that was comparable to that found in ancient Alexandria or Rome. By the mid-19th century, daily per capita water consumption in London reached 14 liters or 3.7 gallons. And third and finally, London gained a great amount of its cultural authority from the ancient world. The British Museum is very deliberately full of material from antiquity, brought here to the new capital of the New World Empire. And the material that decorates London includes an obelisk from Alexandria, brought here and placed in a very prominent spot in the center of the community. Well, London's plan certainly resembles the spaghetti bowl of Venice, until the Georgian period in the early 19th century, when we see the triumph of orthogonal planning in new areas to the west of the city, fashionable Mayfair, Pimlico, and South Kensington. Once again, the ancient world asserts its importance. Which is all fine to point out parallels or inheritances from antiquity, but what lessons can we draw from ancient cities that will make a difference in how we live in our communities or plan ones for the future? When we think back on successful cities, location, of course, is key. But what seems even more important for long-term sustainability is that the larger the city, the more absolutely critical it is to establish smaller communities within it. As I mentioned in Lecture 21, urban planners, people smarter than me, calculate that the most you can expect someone to walk in a neighborhood for goods and services or city amenities like parks is about 400 meters. That is remarkably close to the size of the neighborhood arrangement that we think existed in Uruk in 2900 BC, to the size of the districts in Alexandria, and also just about the distance across the pedestrian city of Timgad, founded in AD 100. Our current or 20th century insistence on corridor development, that is, commercial areas that only flank busy roads, and of ruthlessly isolating zoning laws, is setting up, I believe, the necessary preconditions for urban collapse. Mixed-use areas where people live, shop, work, and worship in neighborhoods seem to be the way to go. And we in the developed West seem to be returning to them just to find out that many never left. To gain a sense of what ancient cities might have been like to experience, we need to go somewhere like Jodhpur, at the heart of India's northwestern state of Rajasthan. Like Alexandria, it was founded deliberately as a regional capital. Rather than relying on the sea for its connections, it had roads across the land connections that made it the regional capital and connected to all parts of the area. But in addition to administration, arts and crafts thrived here as they did at Alexandria. And these developed into an industrial base, which actually has become the economic base of the community. Going down the residential streets of Jodhpur, you'd see that residential is a misnomer in modern terms, but in ancient terms, it fits. The streets have shops on the ground floor and residences above, and they've moved, very often, goods for sale out onto the sidewalk to catch the eye of passers-by in ways that are very familiar from the ancient world. I'm thinking of reliefs from ancient Rome and the city of Ostia, which show shopkeepers with the doors of their shops open and their material brought out, blocking the sidewalk essentially. And also the examples that we saw in Athens on the edge of the Agora, where shops and workshops of people like shoemakers and sculptors were public space and people gathered, and it really became an extension of the streetscape. Now, in the past, we might have looked on such an arrangement of urban life as primitive, but perhaps there's more wisdom to it than we realized. So, what about the future of the city? Is it an eternal concept, or do technology and transportation innovations give us a series of changes that will enable us to stay in touch while living in ever greater isolation? because that's what we're talking about, I feel. Not distance, but lack of connection. Are these what are going to ultimately lead to the death of the city? Well, in brief, I'm going to gaze into my magic 8-ball and say that the city is here to stay. Technology and transportation won't overcome the desire of people to live in a community, especially one that shares their values and identity. That's one of the great lessons of the Epic of Gilgamesh from the Sumerian city of Uruk. People need a society, regular human contact and connections. They need a city to be fully human. Well, city planning, like so many other creative endeavors, is cyclical. That is, current practitioners react against what came before. But for some time, we've been in a cycle that favors the urbanism that would be familiar to a city dweller from antiquity. In fact, places like Glenwood Park in Atlanta, Georgia, have been built with size, scale, and design that are remarkably similar to the insula model at Rome and Ostia, and really the best mixed-use neighborhoods in antiquity. In fact, I'd even go farther and say not just size, scale, and design, but materials. If you see Glenwood Park, what you see is something that looks like a 3-story insula, brick-faced concrete construction built right up against the sidewalk, filling an entire block with 2 stories of residences above. It really is remarkably identical to what we see walking down the streets in Ostia. And viewed against the skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta, it's a stark contrast. It's the 20th century brought up against the 21st, or the first. This form of the new urbanism is in many ways a backlash against the urban planning model that dominated in the mid-20th century. That urban planning trend was called modernist and was based on the philosophy of urban planning as a rational, science-based practice. Initially, a reaction against overcrowded city centers, modernism was inspired to liberate people from the inner city. The result of its application is low-density sprawl. Another component of it was the strict separation of land uses. Tremendous numbers of single-family homes were placed together in neighborhoods that were not walkable and far from commercial or civic districts. This planning, which required one to be a driver to commute not just work, but from shopping, entertainment, and worship, was ironically most successfully championed by Robert Moses, who himself did not drive. This new urban form, the modernist planning form, had elements based on the work of the father of urban planning, Hippodamus of Miletus. For example, its emphasis on ideal, rational design, and the creation of separate use zones for civic, commercial, or residential areas, all things seen at the city of Miletus, designed by Hippodamus. To be sure, modernist urban design carried these tendencies to an extreme that Hippodamus never imagined. It also creates a direct alternative to exclusivity, which has led to the gated community, a primarily suburban phenomenon, usually consisting of a residential community that restricts access. In most cases, the homes and their neighborhood facilities, if there are any, are off limits to non-residents for reasons of security, comfort, and I think this is an important consideration, prestige. This increasingly pervasive form of design relies on a tendency towards separation and segregation, if not formally by race, then informally by class, that is, economic class. And it has many proponents. The same tendency is seen in non-gated communities that celebrate the limited range of wealth of their inhabitants, thus ensuring that the members of this generally suburban community feel a common bond. I'm thinking here of real estate development signs, which I see when I'm driving up and down the highway. They generally seem to advertise something like houses from the 260s to the 290s, or in my neighborhood, houses from the 160 to the 190s. We're kind of in an economic slump, or a similar range. The implicit message is that if you can afford to live there, everyone in the development will be like you. This is a very powerful and attractive notion. It's comforting. It does not, however, necessarily create a true community out of these groups of alike individuals, as the gated community or the suburbs often do not have the amenities necessary for sustaining modern life. And I'm thinking here of basics like grocery stores, not just amenities like parks and swimming pools. For these, therefore, the residents need to leave the development, as they do to commute to work and worship. Many of these developments also do not provide common areas for gathering, meaning that the residents often spend the majority of their time in their own homes rather than engaging with their neighbors directly. So what they have created is a group of, fairly homogeneous individuals, at least in terms of the cost of their houses, who actually come to these houses but don't interact with one another because the design of the facility has not created the opportunities for them to do so. This form of segregation is antithetical to the new urbanism, which not only provides mixed-use neighborhoods, but mixed wealth, from large houses to small apartments, all not just on the same street, but generally on the same block. There are a number of models for this, such as the South Dunn Street development in Bloomington, Indiana. This new urbanist development is inside the city, not outside, so it's infill development, not suburban, and it includes a range of residences, from small apartments to large houses. And there's really a range. There's, I think, 4 or 5 different sort of steps as you go up. And it also has a commercial area as an integral component of the entire development. Furthermore, the residences all have front porches and are placed on fairly small lots linked by sidewalks to encourage pedestrian rather than vehicular travel. And one way that they've made this possible is that they've put the garages behind the houses on alleys the way they used to be. So you don't have garages between houses, and people can't just pull into their garage and enter their house directly from the personnel door that links the garage and usually the kitchen. They can't do that. They have to walk around the house. And it forces them to, really walk somewhere in the community. The notion is that those who live in a community will become invested in it, and social contact will lead to a desire to solve the community's problems rather than to escape them. This is, in fact, a throwback idea, and like much cyclical urban planning, I think it's a backlash against the suburban sprawl that grew up in the 1960s, particularly the late 1960s. In my town, Hamilton, Ohio, the owners of the big industries in the 19th and early 20th century, and there were some enormous industries there, included the local brewery, which was a huge facility, the malt house that malted barley to serve all the breweries in the region, and a gigantic paper mill down on the river. All of the owners of these all lived literally either next door or across the street from their facilities. My own house, actually, was built for the owner of the brewery. And the brewery, which sadly is no longer with us, was actually right next door to my house, which would have been really convenient. It's unfortunate that Prohibition put an end to it. All the workers, as well, for these industrial facilities lived in the neighborhood as well. Now, there's certainly an element of nostalgia in this form of urban design, but also, I think, an awareness that a sense of community takes engagement with the community. You can believe that the wealthy Romans who lived in Roman cities were concerned with infrastructure and ensured that it functioned. If an aqueduct broke, or water pipes broke, or the sewer wasn't working, or whatever the infrastructure problem was, dirty streets, you can be certain that wealthy Romans complained about these things to their friends, to the magistrates, and got them fixed. Probably largely for themselves. This is self-interest. But that concern benefited the less wealthy as well, because they're living in this mixed neighborhood, so that the less wealthy get these benefits of the engagement of the very wealthy. Now, when discussing lessons from ancient cities and applying them to urban life today, we ought to keep in mind that there are a number of ways in which ancient cities failed. For example, the lack of zoning laws in antiquity is a failure we've by and large avoided. Not that modern zoning laws are always great or well considered, and they can be used badly, but they can be used. In antiquity, even potentially dangerous or poisonous industrial facilities could be placed next to densely occupied housing. Today, we wouldn't place a grain elevator, which is a massive explosion risk, next to a large apartment building, or a metalworking facility. The toxic fumes that come off of smelting metal are, toxic, next to a courthouse. In antiquity, these happened in the city of Ostia and in Athens, respectively. Other failures we have unfortunately duplicated. The construction and abandonment of company towns such as Kahun and Deir el-Medina in Egypt have many parallels in modern company towns, from Copper Mountain, British Columbia to Fordlandia, Brazil, Henry Ford's workers' town for his failed rubber plantation. Of course, when work is based on extracting or exploiting raw materials from the earth, then workers have to live there, no matter if it's rubber trees or mines. But we can ask, is there any way to stop building towns or cities that will be abandoned in perhaps a few years? Perhaps the lesson is to build them differently. Maybe, as in the Egyptian examples, using local materials and practices. Or to use modular construction, again as seen at Kahun. Modern modular buildings, however, don't have to be permanent. Temporary options exist, and the buildings can be disassembled and moved, either to the next location or to be repurposed. Now, some city failures are replicated even today, and I just can't see how to avoid them. Uruk in Mesopotamia and the Harappan cities along the Indus Valley seem to have collapsed when the rivers they were built next to and relied on changed course. The same sort of disaster befell Rodney, Mississippi, Bend City, California, and La Paz, Arizona. Well, actually, the earthquake that caused the river shift didn't help Bend City at all, but once the river changed course, there was no incentive to rebuild the community and it was abandoned. Now, it's certainly possible that this kind of thing may happen with increasing frequency as water becomes ever more scarce in the decades ahead. Well, one of the major themes of this course is the role of religion and religious structures in creating cities. Some scholars conclude that the need for communal labor to construct religious buildings was a fundamental driver in the creation of cities. Certainly for millennia, such structures have defined cities. Often they're built in prominent locations. High ground is a popular choice, as the Athenian Acropolis, or the Acropolis at Kahun, and the Capitoline at Timgad all demonstrate. And religious structures were often among the largest buildings in the city as well. Today, houses of worship are no longer the largest buildings in the community, either by height or by footprint. And I think it's worthwhile to ask ourselves, what is going to replace religious structures in terms of their centrality and ability to define the community? This is a question of urban design that I would love to see cities take on directly. Some have, and their answers to that question tell us a great deal about community values. One example is illustrative of this issue. Philadelphia, which famously had an unwritten rule for much of the 20th century that no building should be taller than the City Hall, which at 548 feet, or about 167 meters, was pretty tall. That lasted from 1901 until 1987. Since 1987, at least 8 taller buildings have been constructed in the city. But that run of 87 years was remarkable and a tribute to respect for both civic government and to William Penn, the founder of the state and the city, whose statue capped the building. Essentially, the agreement meant that no buildings could be taller than Mr. Penn himself. Well, the tallest building since 2008 in Philadelphia is the Comcast Center, headquarters of the cable company Comcast. This raises some interesting and frankly existential questions for the community. Has Philadelphia really replaced its respect for William Penn and city government with an admiration for Comcast? Or is it a sign that power in the city is now available to the highest bidder? Has Philadelphia lost an element of respect for community? Is it worth restoring? Well, I could talk about these concepts all day, literally, but let's not. Instead, I'd like to leave you with a challenge. As you walk around a city, whether yours or another you happen to be visiting, I'd ask you to cast your mind back to these lectures and think about what you would change in that city if you could. And then consider what you could do to make that change a reality, because you have a chance to shape urban history too.